Good evening from Australia, good morning to the UK, and hello and good day to wherever else you may be in the world. Welcome to this very special public forum on the moon, held in virtual form. My name's Annie Hanma, and I'm a PhD student at Sydney University's School of History and Philosophy of Science, and the creator of the Space Junk podcast. And tonight, I'm very excited to be hosting this truly global event. We have over 220 registered attendees today from over 13 countries. This event is being produced and organised by the Office of Other Spaces, Catapult in the UK, and my Space Junk podcast. The satellite applications Catapult is one of a network of UK technology and innovation companies which aim to drive economic growth through the commercialisation of research. Tonight, Catherine Hamlin is joining us from Catapult behind the scenes in Mission Control. Also in Mission Control tonight is Thomas Gooch, founder of the Office of Other Spaces and the Office of Planetary Observations, and the Australian coordinator of the Moon Village Association.
Hi, my name is Thomas Gooch. I'm the Australian coordinator for the Moon Village Association. I'm really excited to bring you tonight's third public forum on the moon, the Newcastle edition. I really hope you enjoy. And if you'd like to know more about the Moon Village Association, please get on their website for content, background issues, upcoming events, all to do with mining, architecture, culture and environment, and much, much more. Thank you.
We would also like to acknowledge Jack Dwyer, who's a stalwart of the Newcastle space community and the National Space Society of Australia. And we would like to acknowledge that this event is supported by Inspiring New South Wales as part of National Science Week. Let's introduce our topic for tonight. The idea that spawned this event was to consider how do we give nature a legal and powerful voice in regard to the moon as part of a decision-making process? How do we consider this as an opportunity when we look at it as a relatively blank canvas? One idea is to make the moon a stakeholder in the decision-making process by giving it legal personhood, like has been done for rivers and mountains on Earth. Of course, as we're going to hear through this discussion, the practicalities of actually granting legal personhood to the moon, especially at this point in time, are complex and maybe too complex. But that said, we're here talking about it, and in a way, that's what I'm most excited about. By shifting our thinking beyond the realms of pragmatic realism towards something as frankly bold as legal lunar personhood, we free ourselves up to think more deeply. And as a result, this is a very different conversation to the one we might ordinarily have. This is a discussion without an agenda, without a script, or even a clear conclusion. It's unusual that we've got nothing to push for or against in this discussion. So it really is just an opportunity to hear eminent speakers and experts within their field explore the relationship that we have with the moon and with the Earth, and in the context of a wider space environment. We each bring our expertise, but tonight we're brainstorming together and workshopping a complex idea as a pathfinder to a deeper understanding of ourselves and our landscapes. And you, the community who have joined us today, this morning, this evening, across the world, are part of this conversation and this process of idea generation. I, for one, am hugely excited. An enormously important part of every conversation is acknowledging and engaging with traditional wisdom. I'm zooming in today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and Australia's First Peoples have had a relationship with the moon that stretches back in time for tens of thousands of years. So I'd now like to hand over to Aunty Phyllis Darcy, who is joined today by her granddaughter to welcome us to their country.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our welcome to country acknowledges our people and pays respect to our ancestors and our Creator who created this land. This allows safe passage for all our guests. It is this custom that our people have adopted for thousands of years. It is an act of honesty and respect to reach out and to make sure that everyone from all diversities have a place and are welcome. My name is Phyllis Darcy, and I am recognised as a Awabakalian elder of this land we stand on today.
Ngatawa Phyllis Darcy, Ngatawa Awabakal.
We acknowledge our ancestors, our elders, and all of those who have gone before them.
Ngayan Duman Awabakal Anibarai. Ngayan Duman Yarakal Yalawa, Yalawan, Yalawanan.
As we have done since the dawn of time, we care for this land which our Creator made for us, to make sure that our land is properly looked after. We are a part of the land, for we are its guardians. Our story time is eternally present in the land and its waters, story waters. From the land of Biriban, the Eagle Hawk, from as far as his eyes can see, I welcome all people to Awabakal country.
Paradabirang Birabanumba, Parawanka Nau Kolu, Birikukuang Maya. We are Bang Awabakal Kuba.
Thank you.
Nundukumba Kumba.
Thank you to Aunty Phyllis and granddaughter Terry for that very powerful welcome, and thank you for welcoming us to your country. Now, as we move into this webinar, we must recognise that it does not run on ideas alone. So it's my job to give you the logistics chat. Over in Mission Control, we have Catherine and we have Thomas. So if you look in the chat, you'll find a link to a Slido webpage for this event. On this page, you can ask questions, you can answer polls that we'll be running after each speaker, and you can engage with the conversation that we'll be having here. So please, when you put in your questions, put in your name and what city you are coming in from or country you're dialing in from as well, so that we know where you are. At the end of the formal part of this event at about 7:15 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time or 10:15 a.m. UK time, or approximately 1 hour and 5 minutes from now, wherever else you are in the world, we will provide links in the chat to breakout rooms. So you can join these rooms and have an informal conversation with any of the panelists and speak face to face, just as you might linger after an in-person network event to have a chat and a drink with them. So to begin, in the Slido, you'll see the first poll for the event, which is, should the moon be granted legal personhood? And we'd like to hear your comments on this. And if you just vote on that, we'll see what you think. And as you answer that, I will introduce our first speaker, Donna Lawler. Donna Lawler is the principal at Azimuth Advisory, which is a space law specialist firm. She's a legal advisor to governments and businesses involved in space activities, with 20 years experience in the space industry, including 6 satellite build and launch programs for geostationary satellites. She's also deputy chair of Performance Space, the crucible for risk-taking artists. Okay, Donna, let's get started and we'll have that update in a moment. It seems we're moving really fast when it comes to the moon and new space activities. But what's the current framework of space activities and industry in which we're currently operating?
Thanks, Annie. Well, as you said, my day job is that I'm a commercial lawyer for dealing with the space companies and governments who want to regulate space companies and promote their space industries. There is a current legal framework, and this is what I thought in this first 5 minutes I'd quickly clarify. What's going on in new space and why is everybody excited about the moon? To your question, Annie, what are the international space law treaties that are governing the moon? And in particular, in point 3, does the 1979 Moon Agreement say that is pertinent to this question? And what other efforts are there to agree rules and principles as humanity is starting to gear up to return to the moon more often and with more purpose? Okay, so starting, why is it that people are really excited about the moon at the moment? Well, just briefly, I'm just going to outline what some of our clients at Azimuth Advisory are doing in space, which are private companies. And it will give you a bit of a flavour for how space, which once used to be the province of huge companies and governments, is now becoming almost democratised in that it's becoming possible for smaller companies to do things like create launch. This picture on the right is a picture of a launch vehicle from Gilmore Space, which is an Australian company. Satellite communications capacity, of course, constellations of satellites. We're detecting fire from space. One of our clients is doing that in real time. They're looking at space from space with swarm robotic technologies. They're taking photos of satellites in space, looking for asteroids, servicing, looking at servicing other satellites in space, space tug services to lunar orbits, building things in space, and lunar mining technologies. That's just a quick list of what some of our clients are doing in Australia and in the region. So why are people thinking about the moon? Well, there's been some recent, in the last few years, there's been some reconnaissance missions that have gone to the moon, and they found all these amazing resources in there, rare metals, rare minerals, some rare substances that are used in phones and things like that, and rare compounds, and in particular, a compound which is common on Earth but rare in space, H2O, or otherwise known as water. Now, water could be used, water on the moon could potentially be used, it is speculated, as fuel for a mission to Mars. So one of the key things, apart from valuable minerals that might be used to either increase people's wealth or perhaps to increase the benefit people on Earth, there is also the potential to explore space more. So there is a bit of a race to Mars, and that means that there's also a race to the moon. And people might have seen that there have been recent launches by the UAE and the United States and others to Mars in the recent little launch window. So these are some resource maps of water on the moon. Okay, so what frameworks exist in space at the moment to govern space? Some people are fond of calling it the wild, wild west. But that's far from the truth. In fact, since 1967, which I will confess to my 94 close friends on this call, that is the year of my birth, the Outer Space Treaty, which is often described as the Magna Carta of space law, came into being, and most of the spacefaring countries in the world have actually signed that treaty. And in that treaty, the use and exploration of space is described as the province of all mankind. We would now say humankind, but that's the 1967 style of language, so apologies for that. But the intention, and my view of the intention, is that space belongs not to one country or the first come, first serve, but to all of us. And a number of other treaties followed about rescue of astronauts and objects, liability, registration. But then in 1979, a treaty came into force called the short name of it is the Moon Agreement. Now, not many countries have signed that, only about 18 countries have signed it. Australia happens to be one of them. And in the Moon Agreement, the Moon Agreement states that the moon and other celestial objects are the common heritage of mankind, which goes a little further towards asserting that the moon and its natural resources as well belong to all of us. It's become a hot topic recently. The United States very much, there are many in the United States, not all, but the United States government is currently unhappy with that phrase, the common heritage of mankind. They feel that it could restrict their ability to go and mine resources. So that's a hotly debated topic at the United States and in academic circles about whether or not the moon's resources belong to everyone and should be the subject of a further agreement, or do they belong, or are they available for anyone to use and own? So just to examine some of the items in the Moon Agreement a little more fully, we mentioned the common heritage of mankind. The Moon Agreement actually was expressly put in place in contemplation, even way back in 1979, that one day people would want to exploit the resources of the moon. To that end, the use of moon resources to support scientific missions is expressly allowed. Even right now, someone could do that without any further agreement. However, there is an intention that shortly before resources are about to be commercially exploited, that the states parties should get together and put together an international regime to govern the exploitation of space resources. There are certain principles that underlie that, including an equitable sharing of the benefits, keeping in mind the needs of developing countries, but also the investment that people have put in order to extract resources. So it's not an equal sharing, but it is an equitable sharing that is contemplated. And lastly, the harmful contamination of the moon must be prevented. So there are many other articles in the Moon Agreement, but there's some key ones to keep in mind. So meanwhile, even though not all countries have signed the Moon Agreement, there have been some other efforts to agree lunar rules. So at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, there are some multilateral talks that are being planned specifically to begin discussion on what rules should apply to resource extraction. And they were supposed to start in person earlier this year, but sadly they've been postponed. So that's certainly one place to watch if you're interested in this topic. And one of the co-chairs is indeed from Australia, Professor Stephen Freeland, who some of you will know. Meanwhile, there have been some bilateral attempts to agree the principles. So not all of the states together, but one-on-one. So the United States has recently begun to promote what it calls the Artemis Accords, which are bilateral agreements between the United States and other states that it wishes to work with, like potentially Australia or like its other states in Europe and what they describe as like-minded countries. The Artemis Accords haven't been published in full, although some principles have been discussed, and they are a little bit at odds with the Moon Agreement. They certainly, the United States, which disagrees with the common heritage of mankind phrase, and not just because it says mankind and not humankind, but they disagree with the common heritage bit, are expressly stating in the Artemis Accords that the Moon Agreement doesn't amount to common to international law currently. But I don't think anyone would disagree with that. Meanwhile, there have been some unilateral attempts by some states to make laws about lunar resources. For example, the United States Commercial Space Launch Competitive Act and another law, similar law in Luxembourg, both of which say that subject to international law, anyone from their country who mines resources on the moon or celestial objects owns those resources. But remember the key phrase at the beginning, subject to international law. So to my mind, they're a little bit circular and may not be effective. And then lastly, there are some private efforts to agree particular principles. So the Moon Village Association, one of the organisers of this webinar, has agreed some principles, which I've put on the screen. They're too small for you to read, but you can have a look at later. And then there's another group based in The Hague, has created what's called the Hague Building Blocks, which are some private efforts to discuss what rules might apply. So I'll stop there. That's much more to discuss, but that gives you a little bit of a framework for discussing if the moon were to gain legal rights or legal personality, what framework would it exercise those rights in?
Thank you, Donna. I'm just looking at the Slido. I can see that we seem to have a bit of an echo there. I can see that we're sitting at about 50% of people seem unsure about whether the moon ought to have legal personhood, and around 40% say yes. What's your position on the idea of legal lunar personhood?
Well, I am a lawyer, so I'm likely to answer a question with a question. I think it's too early to say, but I think one of the key questions that needs to be answered first, if we're asking should the moon have rights, is in what framework would those rights be exercised? So my personal hope is that we will reach a multilateral arrangement where the states of the world agree what framework should apply. And if that were to occur, then maybe it would make sense for the moon to have to own itself, even as is the case with some rivers and other parts of our environment. But that would leave that, even if we did get to that point, it would leave the big question unanswered as what are those rights and what values are we trying to protect with that? And to that end, I think it's worthwhile thinking about what does the moon mean to each of us on this planet? And I think some of the other speakers are going to explore that in more detail.
Absolutely. Thank you, Donna. As we move on to the next speaker, you'll see another question pop up on the slido. So feel free to go and have a go at that one while I introduce our next speaker. Dr. Michelle Maloney is the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, an adjunct senior fellow at the Law Futures Centre at Griffith University, director of the New Economy Network Australia and Future Dreaming Australia. She advocates for systems change in order to shift industrialised societies from a human-centred to an earth-centred governance system. Michelle, what are the current developments in the rights of nature and personhood on Earth, and how might these translate to the moon?
Thank you very much. Firstly, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. I would like to thank the organisers for inviting me to be part of tonight. And I'd also very much like to thank the traditional custodians who gave their welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on Turrbal and Yagara people's land here in Brisbane, and welcome everyone to this really fascinating and I think very important conversation. So your question is a very important one, and to give an introduction to some of the key concepts around the emerging rights of nature movement in Australia and around the world. I just spotted my spelling mistake, that's annoying. I'll just briefly introduce the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, which is the organisation I co-founded with some other lawyers and folks from very different disciplines. We created AILA in response to an emerging movement around earth-centred law, rights of nature, and a broader theme called Earth jurisprudence, which I'll talk about in a moment. And from the Australian Earth Laws, or AILA, point of view, rights of nature is just one of many possible ways to stimulate systems change to achieve the goal that we're interested in, which is focusing on how we create regenerative, sustainable human societies on this planet so that we stop the ecological devastation and climate disruption that we're causing, and that we actually create a stable and healthy, biodiverse governance system so that human beings can live in better partnership and relationship with the plants and animals on this planet. But I'm going to talk about this planet and the rights of nature as it's emerging, and then apply some of those questions to the situation with the moon. So the work I do in AILA, this image really captures everything we're interested in. It's inspired by the theory of Earth jurisprudence, which was coined by Thomas Berry, inspired by and respectful of Aboriginal and Indigenous communities around the world. Earth jurisprudence, or earth-centred governance, is very interested in how we can guide humanity to return to the notion and the idea that most First Nations groups have always held, that human beings are just one of the many members of the community of life, that we are not, as the image on the left would suggest, the top of all things, the epicenter of all creation, or the epicenter of evolution. So what AILA is interested in is how we as human beings in the 21st century can shift from this human-centered mode of being and acting on this planet and move back towards the ancient wisdom that all of us as peoples of this galaxy are deeply understood, and many continue to understand. We are just one member of the Earth community. We do not deserve more than the other plants and animals on this Earth. We should be a fairer partner in this wonderful evolutionary journey together. And what's really interesting is Earth jurisprudence, although called Earth jurisprudence isn't just about planet Earth. Thomas Berry and a cosmologist called Brian Swim wrote this really wonderful book called The Universe Story, from the primordial flaring forth to the Ecozoic era. And they propose that a deep understanding of the history and functioning of the entire evolving universe is both an inspiration and a guide for humanity. And this is almost like the Western scientific rethinking of the story of humanity that simply reflects what, as I said, First Nations peoples already knew. That the planet and the galaxy is a mystical, amazing place. And even as a secular human being myself, we don't know everything about this universe. We don't know everything about the planet we live on. And we certainly don't know all that about science or very much at all about outer space. So why are rights of nature laws emerging now in particularly the last 10 years? First of all, a very simple definition. Laws that aim to change the legal status of nature from being human property to recognizing nature as being rights-bearing entities of their own are referred to as rights of nature laws. The reason they've emerged is the same reason we're seeing profound activism around the world challenging what we've been doing to our planet. They fundamentally challenge Western law, which is built on notions of private property and human ownership of nature. If you remember nothing else from what I say tonight, please remember that the fundamental premise of modern industrialized capitalist nations is that most things can be commodified, bought and sold, and made a profit from. It's that neoclassical economic mode of thinking, or even if you want to look further back, the empire mode of expansionism and extractivism that has dominated this globe for several hundred years as the Western views became globalized by big industrialized nations. And these ideas are now literally causing the eating up of the world. Rights of nature is just one of the many ways that people are thinking about pushing back at an endless, limitless idea of how we can keep eating up the earth for human needs or human wants. I will not speak to this slide, but I just wanted to show people that rights of nature laws have been emerging and bubbling up in lots of different countries, in lots of different jurisdictions, in lots of different ways. So please don't feel that either legal personhood or rights of nature laws are in any way the only way forward. The thing that we need to know is that the rights of nature is emerging as both a fundamental law across an entire jurisdiction, like a country, or ecosystem specific, which is often touched on as legal personhood. And exactly as the previous speaker said, how the rights of nature might apply to the moon will very much depend on how we construct it. Who would grant those rights? International community. Who would have those rights? What rights should the moon have? And who could speak on behalf of the moon? So I'll leave it on that slide that if the moon had its own legal rights, it would in fact challenge the whole notions of common heritage of mankind. It would challenge human property, and it would say that the moon in fact belongs to itself, and we should probably give it maximum protection.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that incredibly capable summary of a very complicated area of international law and environmentalism. That was really interesting. Now, on the Slido, if you head to the link, which I think Catherine's going to post again, you can see some polls, and we're not going to talk about them here now. We might come back to them at the end just for the sake of time, but I would encourage you to engage in that conversation that's happening over there as well. The next speaker up is Ceridwen. Ceridwen Dovey is a novelist and essayist for the NewYorker.com, Wired, and the Smithsonian Magazine. She's passionate about environmental justice in outer space and has written about the pitfalls of a space resource race led by corporations, the mysteries of moon dust, and Australia's responsibilities to the moon. Her essays have been selected for the Best Australian Science Writing 2020 and 2019 and the Best American Science and Nature Writing 2018. So Ceridwen, when we think beyond the rhetoric of space sustainability, what is it that we owe to space environments, and how can we shift our thinking to value the existence of nature in an off-Earth context outside of these rigid structures that Michelle discussed?
Thanks, Annie. I'm just going to share my screen, and then I'm actually going to just turn my video off here. I know for many people, it's a confronting idea to grant the moon legal personhood. That's exactly the point of this thought experiment, to jolt us out of complacency and to startle us into new perspectives. To think about the moon's conservation is a way to give oxygen to alternative ways of thinking about space, as being part of nature, as having the right to exist outside of any use benefit to humans, and as a balanced whole universe system where meddling in one part may have consequences we barely understand. As Michelle's already discussed, on Earth, Western legal systems have long treated nature as property to be used and abused under the delusion of endless abundance. Ideally, we should step ahead of the curve to stop this misguided approach from becoming the norm in space, checking the human fetish for possession, critiqued in 1793 by William Blake in this iconic print. Yet I keep noticing failed assumptions about nature still hold sway in the mainstream space industry. One such assumption is that it's impossible to pollute space since it's so vast. It's somewhat easier to ask people to care about pollution of the moon's environment because of our ancient connection to it as a charismatic celestial feature. But there are other space environments in more immediate danger. We're only just beginning to understand the orbits around Earth as a shared resource that needs to be conserved as passionately as forest or ocean health. And yet, even though we can now quantify space junk, there's nothing stopping companies like SpaceX, Amazon, and OneWeb from launching tens of thousands of small satellites into orbit right now, in the race to be the first to create an encircling mesh for their satellite broadband empires. SpaceX defends its actions by saying their Starlink launches are legal because the US Federal Communications Commission has approved them. On paper, yes, these launches are legal, but only because the FCC circumvents environmental law in approving them by claiming a categorical exemption, because in the FCC's own words, satellites have no significant effect on the quality of the human environment. This is one of the most significant planet-altering developments in history, yet there's zero environmental impact assessment required by the FCC, and no thought given to the disastrous effect of these constellations on astronomy, let alone the degradation of our own night sky, the ultimate wonder of the natural world. So sure, it's legal, but that doesn't make it right, especially if those laws are already skewed to benefit companies. And SpaceX slapping a bit of black paint on a few of its satellites and claiming the problem is solved reveals just how little they know or care. All this does is overheat the electronics and cause disruption at other observational wavelengths. Just as it was technically legal for mining giant Rio Tinto to destroy a 46,000-year-old Aboriginal heritage site this year in Western Australia. Juukan Gorge's ancient rock shelters were blown up, an act much worse, to put it in context, than a mining company blowing up Stonehenge, which is only 5,000 years old. When there was a global outcry, Rio Tinto said that under state law, they were within their rights. If this is what mining companies get away with legally on Earth, imagine what they'll do on the moon, far from view. Another concerning assumption I see gaining traction is that it's fine to treat the moon as a nuclear waste dump. NASA proposed in 1978 that we send nuclear waste to the moon, an idea now seen as ludicrous. Yet most of the recent proposals for long-term lunar settlement still depend on power from nuclear reactors. And NASA is now testing a reactor that uses highly enriched uranium. So this undoes decades of work against nuclear weapons proliferation on Earth, since weapons are made from this same material. Nuclear-powered settlements off Earth are often justified by those in space industry by saying the moon's surface is a cosmically irradiated wasteland already. Yet this is exactly how polluting industries think about nature on Earth, dumping nuclear waste on islands, into lakes and the ocean, or burying it in the seabed. Nuclear concerns aside, there's also the risk of the moon's surface boundary exosphere, a very thin, fragile atmosphere, being irreversibly polluted by rocket exhaust gas from increased landings and launches on the moon's surface. This is why I believe we need a grassroots movement of concerned citizens from around the world to pay very close attention to what their own governments are enabling when it comes to the pollution of outer space. Because it is domestic space law that has the power to determine the immediate future of space environments. The 5 commissioners of the US FCC can approve these launches that then affect the entire world. Like with climate change, we know that the companies set to profit the most will hide their negative impacts. They'll dress up their polluting with claims of humanitarianism and say they're doing us a great service by bringing satellite internet to the world, for instance, or using up all the ancient water ice on the moon to fly a few humans to Mars. But we don't need a plan B right now. We need to pour our money and attention into planet A. The pesticides industry used the same tactic when they tried to silence the scientist Rachel Carson after she published Silent Spring in 1962 about the damage caused by DDT to ecosystems. Pesticide companies claimed they were saving humanity because their chemicals would enable the world to feed itself. How wrong they were. The ecologist Aldo Leopold once asked, what could we learn by thinking like a mountain? What might we learn now by thinking like a moon, or at least like a mountain on the moon? The Scottish writer Nan Shepherd also used mountains to think with. To understand landscapes, she wrote, to listen is better than to speak. In the spirit of listening, what if we could give the moon more time undisturbed by us? Just as Australia led the way diplomatically in establishing a 50-year ban on commercial mining in Antarctica, can we do the same for the moon and leave it in peace until we've become more responsible custodians of nature in space, until the idea of granting the moon rights of nature is no longer confronting, but widely accepted.
Thank you, Caradwyn, for that very fascinating and powerful introduction. And I'm looking forward to talking more about this view of space as part of nature during the Q&A section. I noticed that in the Slido polls, the idea of the moon as being part of nature has 4.9 stars out of 5, which is better than my Uber rating. So with that said, we're going to move on now to Professor Alice Gorman. Associate Professor Alice Gorman is an internationally recognized leader in the emerging field of space archaeology. She sits on the Advisory Council of the Space Industry Association of Australia and is a mentor in the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs Space for Women program. She is also the author of the award-winning book, Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe, and tweets us at Dr. Space Junk.
So what I'm going to do tonight is talk from the perspective of my work as a space archaeologist. Basically what that is I study the artifacts and places that are associated with space exploration in the 20th and 21st centuries, not just as a material record, but also as the heritage of particular communities on Earth and indeed of all humanity. In an earlier career, I was a heritage consultant working with Indigenous communities to mitigate damage to their heritage sites caused by mining. So I have a really keen interest in what this means for the impacts of mining on the moon. So just to define heritage very briefly, what it is, it's as simple as the things from the past that are passed down to present and future generations. And these can be physical objects or they can be places that hold memory for us, that actually keep memory alive. And these are places like Tranquility Base, the site where humans first landed on the moon in 1969. So these places could be considered heritage almost at the species level. There's over 100 artifacts at Tranquility Base alone as an archaeological site on the moon. And these objects are full of meaning and memory. But they're not just made by humans, they also shape human behaviour in their own right. And it's in this context that I want to consider two aspects of personhood for the moon, memory and agency. So can we back up the concept of legal personhood for the moon with some actual features that we consider to be part of human personhood? Can we use the concept of legal personhood as more than just a metaphor? So the 19th century philosopher John Locke considered that memory was a key feature of personhood. And you can argue that the moon has memory. This is one of the reasons that scientists want to understand more about lunar geology, to retrieve memory about the separation of the moon from Earth and the early history of the solar system. So it's now quite common to attribute memory to environmental features on Earth like the oceans. And this doesn't have to be memory in the same way we understand it for humans. There's many, many different types of memory. So this memory is stored in geological features like craters, lava fields, which show the evolution of the moon, and those regions of the moon where there are permanent shadows 2 billion years old that preserve the much desired water ice. So these are like archives that store the knowledge of past events. The most recent layer of memory is the intervention of humans, the 60 years of robotic and crewed missions, which sit lightly on the surface of the moon. So this is human heritage for sure, but this is also now part of lunar memory. So how can we consider that the moon might have agency? The International Committee on Space Research, or COSPAR, maintains the planetary protection policy. And this policy is very concerned with having potential harm on life or the remnants or evidence of life on other planets and moons. In the policy, the moon basically requires very little protection because it is considered to be a dead world. Recently, social media went a bit wild with the story that baby witches from the million-strong TikTok witch community had hexed the moon. More experienced witches reacted with fury at their hubris, meddling with powers that they didn't understand. And people thought that I would be very annoyed at the apparent irrationality of this action and this response. But far from being annoyed at what appeared to be an abandonment of what we think of as science, I actually found myself almost energized and delighted by this story, because for me it demonstrated how the moon was perceived to interact with human life on its own terms. The witches took the moon seriously as an agent in human affairs. So in my opinion, when humans return to the moon, they will not find it a dead world where nothing happens and time is all the same. It's actually a very active landscape that's shaped by the influence of light, shadows, and dust. Its agency is seen in how it places constraints upon the desires of humans to plunder its resources. It reacts to human disturbance by mobilizing microscopic dust that irritates lungs, breaks down seals, and prevents equipment from working. So this is not passive, but nor is it hostile. It's just the moon being itself. Australian ecofeminist philosopher Val Plumwood would see the moon as a collaborator or a co-participant in human affairs. It existed before humans did, and likely it will exist after. It's not formless dead matter lacking creativity. As Plumwood says, when the other's agency is treated as background or denied, we give the other less credit than it is due. We can easily come to take for granted what they provide for us and to starve them of the resources they need to survive. So this leads me to end with another question. If the moon is a legal person, what resources does it need from us to sustain its memory and agency? and how can we achieve what Plumwood has called a mutual flourishing? With that.
And Alice, if I might bring you to such a banal point, what do you think is your final position on the legal lunar personhood issue?
Well, I guess like people who responded to the poll, I'm neither for nor against, but I do think what's critical, we need new thinking about the moon. And we've already mentioned a few times Indigenous perspectives on the moon, the fact that it's not all about a particular sort of Western capitalist colonialist version. And I think a lot of this is about where we draw the lines. And we assume that the lines have to be in this one place, and they don't. We need to explore other places for those lines to be drawn. So I don't know, but I think we need to have these conversations, which is why I'm like so excited about being part of tonight's event.
Thank you so much, Alice. We're now going to move to our last speaker. And while we get set up for that one, if you head over to the Slido, there is a word cloud activity where we're asking you to identify things you'd want to do on the moon if you went there. Now, Gabrielle is our last speaker, and Gabrielle Harris is the founder and managing director of Interchange, a culture change company working with Australia's largest listed companies based in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, USA, and other locations. Gabrielle brings a perspective on the everyday business behaviours in stock exchange listed companies which drive market forces. And Gabrielle, I'd like to ask you to comment for us on how we can consider the moon as a stakeholder from the perspective of industry, and what culture we might take with us to the moon and how we can influence that.
Thanks, Annie. I've got all those answers for you, don't you worry. I'll sum that up in 5 minutes. But I am delighted to be here, and it's been so fascinating to hear the perspectives of the other panelists, and I'm madly scribbling notes because I'm learning so much as I go just by listening to these conversations. So thank you for having me, and thank you for organising the event. For me, look, I've always been truly fascinated with culture. When I was young, I travelled the world far and wide, and I just became really obsessed with trying to understand what makes up cultures in a country, in a region, and indeed in subgroups, if you like. And that kind of led me on this path to working with organisations on helping them to articulate their purpose, their strategy, and indeed their culture. And I thought really to start out, I would talk about what is culture and how is that made up, because then I'll link that back to the moon and thinking about from an Earth perspective what it is that we can take with us in our thinking, in our learnings, and indeed history around culture. So culture really, if you think about it from a social psychology context, you can explore it through what's known as intrapersonal topics. So that is my emotions, my experience, my attitudes, and the social context where I live will really start to drive my behaviour. And behaviour ultimately can also be moderated by our legal framework. And that is a lot of what we've been hearing about tonight, is the legal frameworks and how that is actually influencing and driving people's behaviour. What's really interesting for me, though, is that legal frameworks typically come about, or a legislation or a law comes about, as a result of a major negative incident happening. What's exciting about these forums is we're thinking about how can we prevent something like a major environmental incident happening in space by taking our learnings from what's happened historically on Earth. But ultimately, the collection of behaviours is what makes up culture. Culture of, a country, a region, and even an organisation. And I thought I'd just briefly talk about two examples. And I'm going to use Australia. I understand that we do have international guests here tonight, so thank you for joining us. But the two examples that I wanted to use play a little bit into what Donna was explaining to us earlier about the Moon Agreement. So The heart of Australian agriculture is made up in the Murray-Darling Basin, which is ultimately two rivers, the Darling River and the Murray River, that come together, and it feeds us, and it is really essential to our economy. Now, there is an overarching agreement, which is the Water Act, and ultimately what that says is, how can we extract water sustainably from that river system? However, there are also rules and thoughts, if you like, in each of the individual states, and those individual states are quite differing in their views. Now, that is quite challenging, because what we're seeing is that that river system is not being effectively managed. We are seeing unsustainable water levels happening due to the multiple legal acts that sit across those four regions. So from a societal perspective, we need to consider that sometimes those overarching agreements don't necessarily protect something, which is a fascinating view and lens from which to have this discussion tonight. The other example that I wanted to speak about tonight is the organisational lens. And as you said, a lot of my time is spent working with a huge cross-section of organisations. And something that is really interesting to unpack is organisations also have legal personhood. And when you unpack what that looks like in practice, ultimately, an organisation has a collection of owners, and they're called shareholders. The shareholders appoint company directors, and those directors are ultimately responsible and accountable for the strategic direction of that organisation. Now, if you apply that context to the moon, and you think about the Moon Agreement, and I'll probably get the words wrong, so excuse me, Donna, but ultimately it refers to that the moon belongs to all of mankind, and the resources within it are a collective resource for all of those individuals. So if you consider legal personhood of an organisation in the same way as the moon, then you need to think about every human being the shareholder of the moon. So then the question goes to, then who becomes our spokespeople? Who are the moon directors? And are they then the right people to be making the decisions on behalf of the moon? We look at some history pieces in terms of organisations. In Western society, safety legislation came about because of a major hazardous event that happened in the UK, sadly, a long time ago, whereby a hill collapsed into a primary school. From there, compliance drove organisations to spend a lot of money, quite rightly, on the safety of its people. But legislation is still very much about humans. It's not so much about the environment. Yes, there are some, but is it as regulated? Are the fines as heavy? No, they're not. And so when we start to think about taking what we know now and applying it to a moon context, there are just so many things that we could unpack and learn from, but then there's also all of these unknowns. So I think there's a lot more conversation to be had about this.
Thank you, Gabrielle, for that great summary. Now we're going to roll into a sort of Q&A section now. So I'm going to ask all of our panelists to please turn on their cameras. And feel free to turn on microphones too if they wish to talk, but we'll keep them muted when we're not saying anything, just to avoid any feedback and problems with sound. I think we're just waiting on Donna there. There we go. So let's begin. And we've had this fantastic engagement on the Slido as we've been talking. So first things first, housekeeping. We've made the executive decision to push back the finish time for this formal section to 7:30 p.m. So then we'll move into our breakout groups for the networking and chatting section of things. I think that it's important that we give this conversation, and it's really less of a Q&A and more of a group problem solving and brainstorming session prompted by and in participation with those on this call. So let's begin, and I'm going to ask Michelle first to comment. We've had a couple of questions coming in around this idea of legal personhood. We've had a few different things that are flowing around, and I think fundamentally sitting under all of them is a bit of anxiety around applying legal personhood to entities, which seems to be at odds with the idea of then trying to get away from people-centric law. So there seems to be an inherent contradiction or paradox or conflict at the heart of this idea, just at a technical level. Michelle, could I ask you to comment on that?
Yes, for sure. And excuse me, it's a great question, and I agree completely. So 3 key points I guess I'll make. Number 1, in current Western law, and I'll just repeat what I said before, most of nature, and many of us never think of this, is literally the property of human beings. Land is the property of the Crown in Australia, which is the government representing the monarchy. Good grief. But rights of nature, so the second point is rights of nature laws are trying to say that the living world has just as much right to exist, thrive, evolve, and regenerate as human beings. But the way Thomas Berry and others articulate rights of nature laws is that he actually says bees should have bee rights, trees should have tree rights, rivers should have river rights. What we then saw after 8 years of development in rights of nature-oriented laws was a really unique to the place cultural development in New Zealand, where a river and now a forest and a mountain were granted legal personhood rights. In a lot of ways, lawyers grabbed it as a construct and used it to think about a really different way of going forward. It's a brilliant way forward, but legal personhood can be extremely narrow. It's like what someone else said tonight. Corporations have legal personhood, the same rights as a natural human being. What I would always argue for is if we want to use a rights-based approach at all, so the third argument, I would say the third point, if you want to make nature have greater rights in the current Western legal system, don't use legal personhood. Go down a different pathway. Legal personhood, by definition, is about squishing nature into a personhood, a peoplehood. I mean, there's a whole bunch of legal constructs about personhood that aren't just about being an individual living human being. But if you want to really transform the system and to temper human beings and the current system of over-extractivism, don't use legal personhood. Find a way to make the living world a primary space of reverence. And I'm not being naive here, all First Nations cultures have been successful for millennia because they understood we were only one part of the system. Legal personhood sets up very strange ways of then arguing, well, is this legal personhood rights more than a corporation's legal personhood rights? Sorry, I look like I'm doing a puppet show, but that's really what that conversation starts to look like. Whereas First Nations peoples, and I work very closely with a lot of Aboriginal mates, they saw ecosystems as having, ancestral beings, as having their own kind of space, and another way to say it is a right to exist. But they also had a foundation of a system that saw caring for country and living within harmony with the natural world as a primary goal. So what we have to do is make sure that any form of changing the legal status of nature doesn't just replicate what we do now in the West and in industrialized societies. We are constantly finding excuses and legal hooks to keep exploiting and to keep extracting. So I hope that helps and doesn't hinder. It's fairly complex legally speaking, and I noticed Erin O'Donnell and a few others in comments, they spend their entire academic careers and work life looking at these issues. There's a lot of great material out there. But legal personhood is a great way to stimulate a conversation and honestly not the best way to protect nature, but it's interesting.
Thanks, Michelle. I want to stay on the legal side of things because I think it's important to recognize that legal personhood for the moon may not ever be practical or feasible from a technical standpoint, but nonetheless, it sparks these really interesting discussions, and we've seen that here this evening or this morning, depending on where you are in the world. Donna, I'm about to pick on you next. I wanted to come back to you on the moon agreement. We've had a lot of comments in the chat and also in the Q&A on Slido about really just trying to understand what does the Moon Agreement mean for Australia in a global context and in the context of the Moon to Mars program and so on and so forth? So if we think about the Moon Agreement, does it help Australia? Does it hinder Australia? And why are we part of this Moon Agreement?
Thank you, Annie. And I've seen there's been a number of questions about this. I think what a lot of countries, people from other countries forget sometimes when they think about the Moon Agreement and describe it as a failed treaty sometimes, is that it was actually accepted by the General Assembly unanimously. It is true that only a small number of countries actually ratified it. But I still personally believe it has concepts that are useful for thinking about the moon and which progress the fairly broad concepts that are in the Outer Space Treaty. What does it mean for Australia? Well, I think there is one particular way where it might even be an advantage to Australia if Australia wants to participate in the Artemis program, which is the program that the United States is putting together, and they're gaining partners to work with them to get back to the moon and then to Mars. Setting aside that many of the excellent comments by other panelists about, there is a question about whether it's a good thing to be or a bad thing to be spending money on this kind of thing. But just looking purely about whether the Moon Agreement is a hindrance to Australia, my view is that, at least in one way, it could be a help, because, as I mentioned, the Moon Agreement expressly says that it's okay to use resources in the course in order to support scientific investigation. So if, for example, a company were to extract some water resources from the moon and then use that as fuel to get to Mars, or even possibly sell it to NASA in order to get to Mars, I think that's expressly allowed under the Moon Agreement, which could actually mean that the strange thing is that Australia may have be one of the few countries that has very clear rights under international law to do so, as opposed to countries that haven't signed the Moon Agreement. I know there've been, as I mentioned, there've been attempts to make fairly circular laws that give citizens rights to own minerals and resources from the moon. My view is that those are a little bit unclear and possibly circular, but the Moon Agreement is very clear.
Thank you for that, Donna. Some of the responses we had to the word cloud about what would you like to do on the moon were absolutely brilliant, and I'd like to share them. We had that by far and away the most popular one was that people wanted to jump, which I think I said bounce, but it's more or less the same thing. We also had art, science, and looking back at Earth, and one which I thought was kind of enchanting, which was that someone wanted to do a snow angel. Ceridwen, I'd like to come to you next and ask a question that's come through from someone called Ruth. And I'm sorry, Ruth, I'm not sure where you are coming in from, but feel free to tell us in the chat. And the question is, how do we change the discussion from one of a foregone conclusion to one of, we need to sort our stuff out on this planet first? So really, I guess what we're getting at here is, how do we slow down what seems to be a kind of inevitable breakneck pace and question that inevitability, if we might phrase it in a different way?
It's a great question, Annie and Ruth. It's something I really struggle with as a writer and a journalist who spent most of my career writing about sustainability and climate change on Earth. I sometimes wonder, what am I doing thinking about space environments when we have this planet to protect? And I interviewed Bill McKibben, the legendary climate change activist, American activist, a couple of years ago for a profile. And I asked him, Bill, are you worried about, this stuff that's happening? And he was just, he just said, I think it's absolute insanity to be, spending any time or money on any of this stuff. And the whole idea of having a backup civilization just gives us permission to trash this planet. So I had a bit of a wobble after that conversation with Bill, but what I have come to realize, and it's thanks to many of these amazing women who are on the panel tonight, I am still very much a newbie, but they've all welcomed me into this space. And one of the things I've come to realize is that I don't think the general public yet is aware how urgent this issue is. I think there's something with space and sustainability in space where it feels like it's still, you know, pie in the sky, that we've got all the time in the world to sort this out. And I guess my point of view right now is to sort of think about how do we wake people up from that, you know, collective daze of thinking that it's all going to be fine, and kind of get them to think about using the wisdom of what we've learned from activism around climate change on Earth, and for once in history to anticipate future harm instead of trying to sort out or you know, try and resolve harm that's already been done, which unfortunately on Earth is usually where we get left as environmentalists. We are always on the back foot because we are always, you know, the ones with the least power to actually affect change. And what I find so inspiring to think about space and to think about environmentalism in space is that all is not yet lost. That there are many different futures for the moon, for space environments. But what I would also love for more people to understand is that that gap is very quickly closing. And I feel like the diversity of those futures is starting to dwindle. And we are seeing the same old, you know, military industrial complex taken off Earth. And once those things have happened and have become the norm, then that's a very hard thing to roll back. And so for me, it's so important that we're having these conversations now and trying to get a sort of grassroots movement together of people who can question these narratives before they've been set in stone. And in very practical ways, actually put pressure on their governments to make good decisions now. So in my presentation, I went on a lot about SpaceX and Starlink and the Federal Communications Commission. And that's because it is literally something I lie awake at night worrying about. But there are groups who are trying to do something about it. There's a group in the US who are trying to put together an international alliance of public interest lawyers to file a petition for rulemaking with the FCC, and then if they don't get an adequate response, to actually take it to federal court in the US. So that's the Healthy Heavens Trust Initiative. If anyone's interested in joining them, they're looking for people from all around the world to join in. And what they are wanting to do is to actually get a moratorium on these launches of these small satellite constellations, which are just having the most enormous impacts, but we don't even know what those are because nobody's bothered to actually stop and think about it or do any of the research. So what they would like to ask for is a pause. They're not saying that the digital divide doesn't need to be closed. They're not saying that we shouldn't launch anything into space, but they're saying, let's do this right. So it's groups like that and it's approaches like that that I think we need as many people around the world to be, you know, putting time and energy and just remaining vigilant about what their own governments are doing.
Alice, I'd like to come to you next, because we've had this question in the Q&A on Slido from Rami Mandau from Sydney, who's asked whether we could potentially establish multiple types of zones and regions that could make everyone happy. So could we have zones for mining, zones for heritage, and zones for science, for example? And the reason I'm picking on you, Alice, is because I know that you have a history of working with mining operators to do just this, to find ways of compromising. Do you think that that's possible on the moon? Or do you think the moon potentially is an opportunity to do things differently as a new landscape that we are yet to fully explore?
That's quite a complex question. I suppose one of the things I've been pushing for quite some time is to apply an environmental management framework to the moon, which is effectively kind of a replication of the way we do it in the context of terrestrial mining and terrestrial development. So this is not a framework that currently exists, primarily because we too strongly associate environment with life. And I think the moon is heavily discriminated against because of this perception that it is dead, and which I vigorously dispute in so many ways. However, well, you could argue, and I know this to be true, that the environmental management system on Earth has many, many failings and often fails to protect the environment. But one of the key features of environmental management, as opposed, say, to space situational awareness in the context of space junk, is that it looks at things as a series of competing interests and tries to find a win-win out of it for everyone. That often doesn't work, but that is kind of the intention. So that is a straight mapping of terrestrial processes into the context of the moon. And we haven't even got that far. We are not even anywhere close to that point, nowhere near it. So we have no baseline to start with. However, what is needed, I think, and relating to some of the points that other speakers have made, we've been so used to thinking of Earth and impacts on Earth and anthropocentric and pterocentric views, and we really have to shift our focus to the solar system as a whole, and to looking at both our planet, our moon, our current state of life, our current legal regimes and belief systems as one of a number of many, many, many possibilities, some of which I suppose is kind of what we're doing tonight. We're taking one little strand of something that's often considered peripheral to these debates, and we're centering it to see where we end up. So I think we perhaps do need to start constructing completely new ways of approaching how we might do this. So coming back to Rami's question, zones isn't a bad idea. Like, it kind of works on Earth. There's currently, for example, a NASA set of guidelines for protecting heritage sites on the moon, which uses the same principle that I myself often recommended to my mining company clients on Earth, which is to put a buffer zone around a heritage place in order to prevent earth-moving machinery or blasting, precisely what did not happen in the Pilbara recently, to protect a place. And that actually works reasonably well most of the time. But why zones are not going to work on the moon is because lunar dust does not respect a zone. And this I noticed someone in the comments said, we're so far, the technologies we require to operate on the moon, we're so far from having those as well, that we probably don't need to worry too much about things happening next year and us being taken by surprise. And one of the problems that has not yet been solved is the impact of lunar dust, which is going to make, it made surface operations for the Apollo crews after a few days almost unmanageable. There are some amazing scientists working on this issue, but this dust will not respect boundaries. It will cross the zones and what is the liability for the stirring up of lunar dust destroying someone else's industrial operation on the lunar surface? So I think maybe in the first instance, this could be a practical way of going. And in fact, the whole safety zone concept is something that's being addressed by the Artemis Accords. But we need new thinking. As many people say, one of the issues with establishing governance on the moon is a lack of sovereignty. And I actually don't see that as a problem. I think let's abandon sovereignty to begin with and construct our edifice of governance from a completely new position. And maybe that position is going to be something like legal personhood, but maybe, as Michelle said, we abandon the legal concepts and build it on completely other concepts because and this where we perceive the law to begin and end also differs between different people. And maybe we just shift all of the definitions, shift all of the stakes, start our discussions from a completely different point, exactly as we're doing tonight, and see where we end up. So that's not very close to Rami's original question, but There are my thoughts.
Thank you, Alice. Michelle, I can see you nodding, so I'm going to come to you for a quick comment on that. And then Gabrielle will come to you to comment on, here's your challenge, based on what Alice and then Michelle says. How do we, in the question by Angela Dennis in Brisbane, what would we need to change about the culture of the growing space industry to meet that challenge? So Gabrielle, I'm going to let you think about that while Michelle says something in response to what Alice just put forward.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I won't take long. I was nodding because one of the things that I've spent a long time working on within AILA is challenging the current Western legal system as a whole, and trying to find ways where our modern systems can reclaim and embrace being an earthling, being part of the cosmos, way that respects modern life, modern needs, but really regrounds us into a place of respect for the very life forms, for the very system that gave us life. We act as if we are gods from another place and we're just visiting. There is so much to be learned from both Indigenous and First Nations cultures, but also good old-fashioned white fellows who are trying through their environmentalism to reclaim that space to be life-centered. And as Alice said, why should we presume that we can go to the moon and do exactly what we've done on planet Earth and have some success? I think it was Einstein who said, if we keep doing what we've always done, we'll keep getting what we've always got. But I think he said it more beautifully. So if we're going to do anything on the moon, we need to rethink the whole legal system, because we are failing. Industrialized societies have failed to manage their relationship with the living world on this planet, whether it's climate disruption, biodiversity, or any of the other planetary boundaries. We are failing, and we are going to kill the very life source that has given us our evolutionary journey. So if we don't pull our heads in and wake up, we're going to not only destroy the moon just because, we're also going to keep destroying ourselves. So we have to have a new way of thinking, and law should play one part, but it's like everyone else said, the social, the cultural, and I'm not being naive. We also work in the new economy space. We have to rethink regenerative economic systems. And my final comment would be, maybe we actually have enough on planet Earth to do what we really need to do. Let's tone it down. Why should we have a right to go to the moon and mine it? Why?
Thanks, Michelle. Gabrielle, did you want to comment?
Thanks, Annie. I think in order to answer the question around what do we need to change about the space culture, we first need to articulate what is the current state. And as we've heard tonight through the varying perspectives, we've not really landed on that. There's still questions to be asked around what the current state of culture is. As is, what is that future vision? What does that look like? Michelle's just raised a number of really key points around socially, what does that look like? What are the values that we want to attribute to the way that we interact with celestial beings? But also, what are those legal frameworks? And without really knowing exactly where we're going, it's a bit difficult to know what it is exactly that we need to change. So the only answer I can really give to that is more exploration. We have to understand more about what it is, what we want it to be, and what the gaps are in between. And from there, articulate those, the values, the mindsets, the legal frameworks from which we all engage with that space. And there's just so many unknown answers around what that future vision looks like for me to be able to put a flag in the sand, so to speak, and say this is the future vision, and so therefore here's all of the things that need to be done to create the right culture. Doesn't give you an answer, sorry. Just more questions.
But there is an answer inside the precautionary principle of sustainable development. There is an answer, but Westerners don't like that answer. What if the answer was leave the moon alone? No one accepts that.
Michelle, I'd like to take that. No, I want to jump with that into the final question for the evening. And the only reason I'm being rapid is because we're really pushing up on time. And I'd like to get to this final question, which is there in our legal precedent, and I'm combining two questions from Rami and Tony in the chat, which were both very well upvoted. Is there another way that we could look at preventing this sort of activity beyond legal personhood that we might have precedent. And Rami has pointed to the Antarctic Treaty as a potential analogue that we could look at, where there in Antarctica we recognise that it was a unique landscape, and the Antarctic Treaty set on ice, as they always say, the concept of sovereign claims for the life of the treaty. Donna, I would like to come to you for your legal thoughts on whether that sort of thing might be something we could look at, or whether there are principles there we could bring out. But at a certain point, I'm going to jump in and wrap it all up. So Donna, go for it.
Okay, noting that we've just got 3 minutes left, because, and Annie, I know that you're an expert on the comparison between space and Antarctica, but I think I actually look at it from, you know, a more pragmatic point of view, as in, what is it that drives states to agree to restrain themselves? And there are some that read the Moon Agreement as a bit of a moratorium on mining. I don't know if that's actually a correct interpretation, but nevertheless, it's that sort of language can happen. What is it that induced states to agree that they wouldn't appropriate space? And indeed, what induced states to agree that they wouldn't mine Antarctica? And I think the answer usually comes back to they were trying to avoid conflict. So avoidance of war is a big driver. It's a practical driver in getting progress on these things. There's a lot of work to be done in discussing ideas. I think where we're at now is, unless there's something to be gained or a war to be avoided, it's hard to get states to agree, international law at least.
Thank you, Donna. So that just means that it's my job to do all of the thank yous to everyone for their contributions this evening. This has been an exceptionally fun and interesting event, thought-provoking and challenging. And it wouldn't have been possible without the support from our partners. That's Thomas from Office of Other Spaces, Jackie Randalls from Inspiring New South Wales, Catherine Hamlin from Catapult, Giuseppe Ribaldi from the Moon Village Association, and all of our fantastic speakers this evening. Thank you. And of course, to Aunty Phyllis and her granddaughter for doing the welcome. I'd also, inspired by Thomas, like to thank the moon. Thomas pointed out to me that today is the dark moon, the last visible crescent of the waning moon. And in a way, it's like the moon is just holding up a little hand to listen. And finally, I would like to thank all of you who are still present with us for being part of this incredible conversation. I think it's very important that we add our voices to discussions about space and our relationship to and within the space environment. I've been asked to pass on from the Moon Village Association that if you'd like to get further involved in the discussion, the best practice principles are open for comment until September. Those were the ones that Donna mentioned. And so you can get involved in shaping the public's perspective on how we might go to the moon and find out more about those activities. With that, and with my deepest thanks to everyone who has brought this event together and made it possible, particularly to our team in Mission Control and our supporters at Inspiring New South Wales and MVA, I will draw this to a close. Thank you.